You for your participation in the 6th year at the University of Montana of the first-year reading experience. What we've been doing is asking all of our entering first-year students to read the same book and to ask faculty to incorporate, as is relevant, themes and other material from the book, especially in courses like freshman seminar and the FIGs, or first-year interest groups, and other introductory courses. We also have an essay contest for first-year students only, and this year it is held with a cash prize in each of 2 categories, and you should have a little flyer about that, either a scholarly analytical essay or a personal essay. This year we had a team of faculty and staff who selected the Confessions of Max Tivoli and scheduled a number of events. One was a question and answer period this afternoon with first-year students. Another is the author's talk this evening. And then there's a panel discussion scheduled, now write this down, or digitize it and put an alarm on it. Someone told me to say it that way. For Wednesday, October 28th, from 4 to 5, in the Continuing Education Building, often known as TOD, room 203-204. And that panel will be moderated by Dr. Eric Reimer from the Department of English, and we have a group of panelists that represent very different disciplines. Dr. Leslie Scott of Community Physicians Group, who's a local pediatrician, Dr. Cindy Garthwaite, who's the director of the Gerontology Fellows Program at our School of Social Work, and who's an expert on the sociological aspects of aging. Dr. Kim Wallace from the Department of Psychology, who focuses on psychology and environmental factors that contribute to successful outcomes in later life. And Dr. Fernando Cardoza from the Center of Environmental Health Science, who studies the relationship between DNA damage and aging. So again, that's Wednesday the 28th from 4 to 5. I also want to remind you that after the talk, there'll be a book signing outside in the foyer. I, in addition, want to thank the committee for their enthusiasm and dedication. Maybe everyone on the committee could raise your hands. And particularly Megan Stark. They did everything. They read and discussed many books. That, I'm sure, was the fun part. They took on the task of marketing the program with press releases, the creation of special bookmarks, and my favorite, the buttons that say, "What page are you on?" So this evening, I am going to introduce celebrated author Deirdre McNamara from the University of Montana, who will in turn introduce tonight's speaker. Ms. McNamara is the author of a number of wonderful novels: Rima in the Woods, One Sweet Quarrel, The Law of the Land, Red Rover, and My Russian, as well as short stories. As one critic put it, each of her novels is lyrical, insightful, and woven with vivid characterization and a sense of place. Lydia Davis, a contemporary writer and a National Book Award finalist herself, praised McNamara's novel Red Rover as one of the best of 2007, citing her eloquence, compassion, and gentle humor, as well as the novel's special achievement of revealing to its readers a very tangible and curiously liberating sense of how brief our lives really are. We, of course, selected Deirdre McNamara to introduce our author because she had him as a student at one point, and in her faculty colleagues' words, she's an inspiring and exacting presence in her creative writing workshops and classes, someone who has been equally dedicated to her undergraduate and graduate student writers. She's also been a gracious mentor to her students as they have pursued their creative endeavors beyond the program, and Andrew Sean Greer was one of those students. So I give you Deirdre McNamer. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome. What a good crowd. Nice to see you all here. 14 years ago, in the fall of 1995, I was hired by UM's creative writing program. I'd been a visiting writer for the previous 5 semesters at 5 different colleges and universities around the country: Ohio, Oregon, Cornell, Williams, and Alabama, and had one year filed tax returns in 3 states, whereupon I immediately got audited for being, 1, a gypsy, and 2, a writer, for whom, of course, so much of life can turn out to be deductible. I was curious about how the program here would strike me after 8 years away. I'd got my MFA degree here in 1987. And after my time on the road, I wanted to see what I was curious about what I was coming back to. As it happened, I was blown away, gobsmacked, as the Brits like to say. And the reason I was gobsmacked was the presence of Andy Greer and several of his classmates, then second-year students in the fiction program. They were so smart, so talented, so alive to writing, that I felt smarter, more talented, and more alive myself simply by osmosis. What a great feeling. And Andy singularly had a kind of fluidity and speed, a sheerly beautiful athleticism in his writing that makes me think now of one of my all-time heroes, and I'm serious, Fred Astaire, who was, by the way, not just charming and technically accomplished on stage, but was, in the end, watch him closely and you'll see, some higher order of dancer. Others might dance to the music. With Astaire, the music seemed to dance him. Andy came to Montana with a BA degree from Brown University, where his class, who presumably could have chosen from a host of luminaries, made him their commencement speaker. For several years, he hung out in New York City and worked as a chauffeur, a TV extra, as a freelance tutor, an unpublished writer, and then he decamped to Montana. By the time I met him, he was well into a novella that would become his MFA thesis, an exuberant, delicious, ridiculous quest tale, a romance complete with maps and footnotes and bursts of doggerel, lots of characters, lots of energy and hijinks, but also beautiful, elegant language and intelligence and a certain wise sadness whistling around the edges. This is the first paragraph of that novella. It holds up. Make me believe it. That's what I first whisper when I listen to a tale. Though I'm cynical enough to raise an eyebrow at sentiment, to wave aside coincidences and absurdities, yet still I want to believe them. I want to think the world could be this way, serious and resonant and playful. So make coincidences turn out to be planned and make plans ruled merely by chance. Whatever tale you tell, a sad one of lovers unthreaded, or vicious deeds, or ironic reunion, you may decorate it any way you like, but make me believe it. Can the world be this way, serious and resonant and playful? Certainly the worlds of Andy Greer's fiction are. In his story collection, How It Was for Me, and in his 3 novels, The Path of Minor Planets, The Confessions of Max Tivoli, and most recently, The Story of a Marriage, he employs prose littered with sparks, as the New Yorker put it in reviewing The Path of Minor Planets. He employs a capacity for nothing less than enchantment as John Updike famously noted in a lengthy New Yorker piece about Max Tivoli, and always, and to my mind, and maybe foremost, Andy Greer trusts in the myriad possibilities of language itself to, quote, make you believe. There is a kind of writer who envisions a story or has a belief and uses sentences like rail cars to transport that vision or belief to readers. The language is essentially utilitarian. Such a writer's story or novel might be well plotted and even rewarding to read, but the deep surprises are finally few. There's another kind of writer who trusts that the sentence itself, written with passion and curiosity and precision and, yes, playfulness, written for the sound and the feel of the words, takes you to the story, the meaning. Andrew Sean Greer, to his great credit, because it is an uneasy way to work, that not knowing, is one of those rare writers. They are the ones who grow and endure and become important, I think, as Andy has and as he will. Please welcome in.
Well, that's got to be the first time that anyone's ever said my name and athleticism in the same sentence. Wow. Whew. That's a very funny kind of homecoming to people who knew you when you were really a very ridiculous person, to be taken this seriously by people who now see you as a ridiculous older person. I think I remember so much about Montana. I think I'm here to maybe admit to a crime, which probably the department doesn't know about, which was that when I was here, I was always curious about the recommendations that my recommenders wrote when I applied to grad school. Because there was always something funny that people said when they talked about my application. And actually once when the secretary had went to go to the bathroom, I went and I broke into the department files. Went to the copy machine, quickly copied them, put the files back, and ran down the hall to see what was written there. And indeed, one of the recommendations was wonderful, and there was another one that explained a lot about the way people perceived me. It said, Andrew Sean Greer is a self-righteous Dudley Do-Right. That was it. I don't know what I had done to piss off that professor. But I looked at that and I was like, that's what everyone thinks I am. That was the recommendation when I got here. So I feel like I was a struggle to either overcome that or fulfill it completely. But either they accepted me or I am lucky to be standing here today. I think my favorite memory of Montana is, oh wait, I was trying to see if I had a picture of me in Montana, this is actually me in Oklahoma when I was in junior high school. But it was as close as I got. I actually don't have a picture of me in Montana. I think I have one. This also not me in Montana. But just after, these were my visions of what Montana would be. That was me. You can see, I think the most important, or somewhere around there, I look so sad and sleeveless. What's important to realize, I have very long hair there because I couldn't afford a haircut. Because they paid us $6,000 a year to teach here. And so I just decided not to cut the hair. So, dear God, it was a good decision. Once you start losing your hair, you're always fond of those moments when you had it. So I think my fondest memory when I look back was that I'd come to Montana from New York City, from Greenwich Village, which is a fairly dense part of New York, and as New Yorky as it gets. All cabs and yelling at deli owners and that kind of thing. And I arrived in Montana on something called the Rimrock West Stage, which turned out to be a bus, despite my fantasies that it was going to be a stagecoach. Went camping with friends, which is actually, it sounds so absurd, the city folk, but I'd really never done that before, backpacking. We backpacked into some hot springs, and while they it was so beautiful, it was about a 2.5-hour hike. They went and set up camp, and they said, why don't you go into the hot springs? And so I did. It was so beautiful. The sun was setting. There was sort of a clearing, as the river was going along, and you could see the sun setting in the valley, and I was sitting there in one of the pools people had made from rocks. And of all magical things, out of the forest to the left of me came an enormous moose that came out and joined me in the hot springs. And you must imagine, if you will, that I am not from Montana, and it's like a brontosaurus had come from Jurassic Park and joined me in a lava pit. And I think I would have felt more psychologically protected if I had been wearing swim shorts, so that's absurd, but there's something about it, men in the audience, you just think you're going to get stepped on every minute. You're like, she's going to step on me. And I sat there, and maybe it feels like it was for an hour and a half, and we looked out at the sunset together, the moose and I. And then she quietly left me and went into the forest, and then I think I urinated in the hot springs. But it was surviving that moment made me feel like I could survive in Montana in some way, and I've made it now. I'm going to read a little bit from the book, just in case you haven't read it, freshmen, and others. But I always think it's so boring to hear somebody read, so what I was going to do is tell you a little bit about how the novel came together, which is what interests me, and I apologize if it starts to get a little technical or something like that. I'm going to try to keep it entertaining with goofy pictures of me or something like that. I'm going to read you a couple different drafts of the same scene so you can see kind of where it all came from and that kind of thing. Because I think what's important, especially for students who are interested in doing writing, is to know that it isn't really a magical process like a Harry Potter moment where you put on a hat and it says, you're going to be a writer, Slytherin, or something like that. It's more a process of really sort of sludging through the thing. And it's not like someone tells you whether you have a good idea or not. A novel about a man aging backwards, for instance, is really a very bad idea for a novel, as I've often said. It's also a bad idea for a movie, I think. Because when I had the idea, the only thing you can come up with is a sort of a goofy sort of comedy about, he's old, but people think he's a baby or something like that. And I've put this up here because someone's going to ask me about this later, and so I'm going to say, I'm going to talk for a little while, and then there'll be some question and answer moments. There's microphones out there in the audience, sort of in the front in these aisles, and you can ask them. And if you're curious about the curious case of Benjamin Button, that's your moment. And there'll come a moment when there's a big pause, and all of you will not ask a question, and I will just wait here, because I can wait longer than you can, and you'll be very uncomfortable about it, and someone will come up and do the right thing. I think what I'm going to do, I know what it was. I was going to show you these early documents I found, which I hadn't looked at in years. I think there it is. Here, I found this document, which was in 2002. I was looking at titles for the book, and apparently these are the two I wrote down. Isn't that an awful, ever younger, just awful sort of thing? But that was the first one, I don't know what went through my head. You don't have to read this, I'm just trying to show you the kind of stuff that goes on. This was the first thing I wrote down in the year 2000, that's 9 years ago, and you can see already at the top, I wrote down the inspiration for it, a Bob Dylan song, I was so much older then, I'm younger than that now, which was what made me think of writing the book. And then I've got this, I've called it Maximilian, a novel, and I've got this long sort of plot thing that is so not plot. I'm sitting here saying well, I guess he could go to college when he's 55 years old, or he probably could buy drinks for his friends because he seems really old. It's not a plot. But down here at the bottom, down here, this is what's interesting to me. Blah, 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 he's in love with girls, they're too young for him. And then down here, all in caps, it says, he begins a search to find his son. This is the main plot of the novel. So this is literally me sitting down for the first time to think about this book, and it's taken 20 lines down, And I kind of have the first idea of a plot, and I've put it all in caps for myself. And the rest of it never really happens. And then this is the next page of that same document where I've decided to call it The Curious Case of Maximilian Zed. It just sounds so much like that Benjamin Button thing. I had never heard of that story. But here it is. And what a terrible name, Maximilian Zed. I'm so glad I let go of that. In this version, I've decided it's going to take place in the 60s, which is awful. I mean, writing a novel is just nothing but awful idea after awful idea. But there's somewhere in here where it starts to be he finds the love of his life when he's 15 years old, and then years pass and he meets her again when they're both 35 and she doesn't recognize him. And he gets a chance again to see if he can get her to fall in love with him. And that's, in here somewhere, I've come up with that idea. And the rest, the 60s sort of stuff, luckily I got rid of in some terrible draft. But this is still in 2000 I'm doing this. And then I wrote a little age chart. And this will be interesting. This one's so simple. When he's 1, he's 75, so in the middle of his life, he's 37 and a half. Right there. I worked it out so nicely. It seems like such a simple novel. Then I made this one 2 years later, 3 years later, charting out exactly how old he is and what he seemed. Then I made this one. Oh, it's a little off base, kind of on a doily. I don't know. I think when you're writing a novel, you spend a lot of the time not writing the novel, is what it really comes down to. And I thought, if I just get this thing pretty enough, then the whole thing will fall in place. And then, get ready, here's the final age chart. It's got, as you can see at the top, it's got the year, his real age, his seeming age, notes about what happens in the novel, and the page that I wanted it to appear on. So it's got all the plots of the book, and these purple parts are the parts that are actually sections that take place in the novel instead of just summary. If you were ever curious whether writers have a plan or whether they just write their way through the book, I guess my answer is I had a plan, It's a little intimidating to look at all that. I don't have anything like that for my next novel. I just feel like I don't know really where I'm going with that. But what I wanted to show you, what I wanted to read about, was a part in the middle of the book here, at the top, where it says 1905, 1906, over to the right, and it says earthquake. In San Francisco in 1906, maybe you've heard, there was a giant earthquake that sort of tore the city apart. And it was always my plan. I thought, oh, this is great. No one's really written about that. I can make that the centerpiece in the novel. When he's 35, it'll happen in 1906, and he'll look like he's 35, and he'll also be 35. And this will be the moment where he sees the love of his life again, also the moment where there's going to be a big earthquake in San Francisco, and there'll be fire, and something will happen I'm not quite clear about where they'll come together. It'll be the crux of the book. And I planned the whole book around it. He's born in 1871 so that he can be 35 in 1906. I was really looking forward to writing it. Here's my notes about it. 1906, the earthquake. It says love affair with the girl. Here's the plot I came up with at the time. He's tied to a tree outside City Hall and escapes, somehow meets the love of his life again, and they struggle their way through San Francisco, making coffee, helping people move things. That seemed like a really good idea, somehow. God, tied to a tree outside City Hall. God. But here I can, all right, this is what I wrote. I can tell from the dates on everything, right before I started writing the earthquake scene, where it's a little more better. It says details of, dynamiting and the Chinese and soldiers and a cannon and, it says this stuff. And I think this was the moment where I actually started, I started writing this thing. Do I have a picture? Oh, now it gets to a picture. I think the key here is that really you think when you read a book, you make a reader's mistake, which is that you think the way that it it takes me as long to talk to you as it takes you to listen. So you think it takes as long as it takes for you to read a book is the amount of time it takes an author to write it. I mean, you don't really think that, but in a way you do. You think, well, they just had a really good idea and they just wrote it down in a, they're just inspired. And what they are is dogged. It's all about this terrible rewriting, and we try to hide all the traces of it so that it's more, so it's fun for you. You don't trip over everything we bled over. But here I'm going to show you all the blood. I'm sorry. So here's the first scene of the earthquake. My very first try at it. This was in February 4th, 2002. I saw the document's creation, and it was last modified in March 28th, 2002. So this is 2 months of work on this little thing before I abandoned it. And I think what I want you to look at is that there's a lot of historical detail, and he talks about his mom and his sister, and there's a lady with a dog that she hides under her robe, and this kind of stuff that's going to show up later, but doesn't really make it into the final book. This is a love story, so I will spare you the flames and broken glass. You may fill in all the details of the disaster that you learned in school, the twisting motion of the world as if being wrung dry, the sound of 1,000 violins, my wristwatch dancing on the dresser, the final lurch, and then a span of 10 seconds before it began all over again. Long enough for me to run down the hall and get Mother into a door frame before her chimney fell through the ceiling and crushed her bed. The stillness after, and then almost imperceptibly from the window, the awful animal moans of the dying. I'm sure you know that the fire that burned our house began about an hour afterwards at Fremont and Howard, when the broken gas lines finally went ablaze with a lamp, a cigarette, we will never know. At instructions from the police, we saved what we could. We dressed in our best clothes, and Mother and Mina put on their most valuable hats, not knowing we would have to wear them for weeks, and packed our dearest belongings into a trunk with Mina's skates nailed to the bottom. Mother set the horses free. Mina carried jewelry wrapped in velvet in a birdcage. Thus dressed, we walked through corridors of flame down Market Street to the ferry terminal, where an army officer was standing guard. Passengers may only bring what they can carry, he told us after an hour of waiting. But it's all we own in the world, Mother whispered. Only what they can carry. For the first time, I wept. Had I been smarter or sturdier, I would have buried everything in the backyard. Some workmen were digging graves for their own trunks, but none could be persuaded to lend me a spade, not for any amount of money. We decided I would take the trunk to safer ground where they boarded the boat, and then we would meet later in Oakland. Naval ships were arriving, spilling seawater. My women waved to me from the water. There was to be no safer ground. Oh, I'm going to cut over this little bit here. I did not meet the man who tried to bring his dead babies aboard the ferry, pretending they were asleep, and who was forced to leave them ashore with all the people it abandoned. I did not see the Circle Hotel collapsing like a concertina, one floor every few minutes as the tourists inside screamed for help. I was not here in history. I was there, over there, out of view all the time. I was there at the ferry building, frantic with the thought that now, at this crucial moment, I might lose Alice. A mad thought, useless, stupid, with the city smoldering around me. It wasn't that I thought she might be dead. I'd heard the solid rock of Van Ness had survived and was far from the fire. No, my main worry, and forgive how crazy this sounds, was that now she would never love me. The sensation was as terrible and petty as realizing 5 miles from home that you have left the oven on, but it was too much for my monster's heart. Others around me were piling their necks with pearls and jewels, throwing on 2 or 3 furs, burying their diaries in the broken street, saving the idiotic junk of their idiotic lives. But I was the idiot king because I stayed not to guard the contents of our trunk, but to keep Alice from escaping again, to keep her imprisoned within the mossy walls of my mossy life. Now the city would burn to the ground and we would all be scattered around the bay or further, and I would never have the leisure to wait a week before I called on her, or sit out an entire dinner before I took the great chance of a kiss. A disaster had brought us together again, and a disaster would now tear us apart. I was a greedy Gorgon who could not let his maiden go. But matter, I could not wait out the flames. I remember thinking this as I dragged the trunk back down Market below the call building, bellowing with flame. I could not wait for fate to bring her back to life within my life. Even if I went on another search, even if it took me only 10 years instead of 20 to find her, it would be too late. You see, my condition would betray me. I thought about this as the skates broke off from the bottom one by one. After a search of 10 years, Alice would be a fading 45. And of course, I would still love her, no matter how fat or weary she'd gotten, but I would not be 45. I would seem a much younger man, 24 or so. It would be too late. We would be too different. I might seduce her, of course. I might even lure her away from her husband for a week in a hotel, a week of unspeakable passion. But it would be too late for love. Women don't lose their hearts to boys. She would drink down my youth. She would think he'll recover, he's young, and she would leave me. But I would never recover. No, if I lost her now, I thought as the army men walked by, my chances would die a little more each year as I grew younger. I couldn't wait. Oh, I remember thinking in my madness, Mother, you were wrong. Time was never on my side. I was barely 6 blocks away in a little park in Chinatown when I could carry the trunk no further. The skates were long gone, and the metal seams were scraped dull from my dragging, and even the few heavy objects I'd thrown onto the street did not ease the burden. It was a pleasant park for a madman, though equally weary people had left all kinds of beloved objects there, and so the grass was piled with valuable paintings, silver, china, carved ivory boxes, and all the typical decoration of the now past Gilded Age. Ordinary goods were piled there as well, salt, flour, sugar, and a small man was using a fountain to make coffee for people, boiling it in a camp stove and serving it in the abandoned china. It's funny how I remember nothing for the historians, but I recall that I drank from Haviland Limoges decorated in pink reeds, and at the bottom of my cup was a nymph-like willow straining against the wind. I stayed there in that fine park for a while, free of all my worldly goods, sipping coffee. There was a peaceful sound of chattering birds, the burble of the coffee and the distant hush of the fire. It was there that I realized what I was wearing, and that I was mad, and I began to laugh. I heard Caruso singing, an old woman said beside me. She wore a hat as black and glossy as a rooster and an unmatching dress. Clearly, like most of us, she had dressed in the dark this morning. Did you? I was across from the palace. It was after the quake. He leaned out his window and started to sing. She closed her eyes and sipped her coffee from a silver creamer. It was glorious. I bet it was. I will never forget it. It saved my life. Then she placed the creamer with great care on the cool grass, as if the mere affectionate touch of her hand might save anything of beauty. But she explained, they're killing people, you know, for looting. She opened her coat as she walked away, revealing a small dog that she'd been carrying all this time, and I thought once again how stunned and sad and crazy we had become. It would turn out, of course, that she was right. Not long after, someone arrived saying the fire was coming closer. We could smell it like camphor held against our faces. We moved quickly, and not because the flames were approaching any more rapidly than before, but because fleeing ahead of the fire in a dark, watery mass came the rats. Okay, and that is where I stopped writing this version. I've read you that much of it because you'll recognize something in the final version. But once I wrote the sentence there, fleeing ahead of the fire in a dark, watery mass, came the rats. I realized I had really gotten off topic. Because as you can tell, and I even skipped a little bit of it, there's kind of a lot of history in there. You know, I clearly had done my research and I wanted the reader to know it. But what's missing is the story. The point is, he's in love with this woman named Alice. And the point is not that he watched this incredible fire taking place. It's sort of fascinating because the rats did come ahead of the fire. But clearly I was going for melodrama. So I had a little nervous breakdown because I thought I've lost track of this novel. It's because the rats are running ahead of it, you know, and I can feel it. And I thought, no, all right, I'll give it another go. I think I have another picture of the earthquake for you to entertain you. There you go. That's fun. So here's my second try. This is a lot shorter. It looks like the document says I started on April 1st, 2002, and abandoned it on April 16th. So that last one I edited a lot to try to make it better. This one is not as edited, so forgive me. This time my idea was, all right, I'm going to take him out of San Francisco, I'm going to put him in Santa Cruz, and then I won't have to write about people clawing through the rubble and Caruso and the rats, you know. I'll get past my worst instincts. All right, so here we go. He's down in Santa Cruz, as I told you, in a hotel called the Venice. A pounding in my head. Mr. Tivoli. No, a pounding on the door in my head. I found I could not move my skull. A splash of splinters in the door was open. Enter Punchinello. You're alive. He was a dark-skinned man wearing an unimaginable hodgepodge of clothing, leather pants, a pink frock coat, a tam o' shanter sewed in pieces, and he ran over to my bed with a look of joy. I later learned that these were earthquake clothes, items chosen in the dark, terrifying seconds between the quake itself and the twisting, horrifying aftershock. Hundreds of thousands had found themselves on the street that morning, not even quite awake, wearing the most bizarre outfits. Women were seen in nightgowns and enormous feathered hats. Men wandered in knickers and ladies' slippers, stunned and helpless in the falling rubble. Old men wore glasses with no lenses, and children appeared in Sunday dress. They would wear these earthquake clothes for the next 3 days, since nearly everybody's home burned to ashes, and this was all they had in the world. When I reached it at last, I would find my elegant old city in a remarkably ill state of dress. What time is it? I asked. It's 9 o'clock. Oh, I think he has an Italian accent. Now we realize you were a missing. We thought he says to kill you. I told you this was a terrible version. What has? You're alive, was all he shouted, kissing me. I don't know who this character is. He never comes back. Was all he shouted, kissing me on both cheeks and letting me smell his lavender cologne. Looking back, I'm astounded that he managed to anoint himself in the middle of a dying world, but perhaps he was readying himself for heaven. We each have our own sweet folly. He's alive, he shouted to some invisible crowd on the canal, and promptly left my room forever. I tried to fall back asleep, but there was too much noise in Venice. So I put on a dressing gown and made my way through the dining room, where I assumed there'd be coffee waiting in a girl-hip samovar. The image of Alice rose in cigar smoke through my brain. I winced briefly, remembering the postcard I had sent the day before. I'd said too much. She would be repulsed. I would lose her for sure now. These were my thoughts as I rubbed my temples and stumbled through the alleys. How did I miss the giant crack in the Great Canal, or the palm trees fallen through bungalows A through D, or the plashing brand-new fountain made by a broken water main? I suppose I was like those mad men at the asylum who never flinched, even when the roof was falling down upon them. We happy men, intent on our private evil, larger even than the ruin of the world. There was, of course, no coffee. The dining room was a mess, and I raised a useless little fuss, shimmering in my gown, shouting for a waiter or a concierge, and no one came. I righted a chair and sat myself at a table filthy with dust and drew a St. Valentine heart in the grime. It began to occur to me that something was off, and I looked more carefully at a newspaper that had fallen on the floor. It was hardly a newspaper at all, just one sheet of paper, badly laid out. Odd for a morning edition of the San Jose Evening News. Stanford University buildings badly wrecked with heavy loss of life. Santa Cruz badly shaken, loss of life heavy, all important buildings destroyed. No trains from north or south had arrived at 8 o'clock. The wires being down, the reports could not be verified. A man is reported to have arrived from San Francisco in an auto, reporting that the disaster there is worse than in San Jose. Late, thousands of people reported killed in San Francisco. Oh shit, I whispered. Oh shit, what happened? The answer came, a careless roll of the earth, like a maid making a bed and flicking the sheet until it lies flat, a roll that seemed to come across the room towards me, lifting chairs in a wave until it sent me to the floor. I tasted dust. It was perhaps the 9th aftershock that morning, but the first that I had felt. Earthquake, of course. How simple. My God is a lazy God, and this is his favorite horror. I could hear tinkling shards of glass and the moan of someone trapped, but all I thought was Alice. All right, I stopped a little later on there because it gets really bad at that point. I get him into a car, and he drives up to San Francisco, and I find him once again, crawling through the ashes, and things are exploding, and the rats are arriving, and there's like soldiers shooting people. I could not get away from, I mean, it starts out kind of bad here, but it just went terribly wrong. And I really was at this point holding the manuscript over the incinerator. I thought, you are not a good writer, Andrew Sean Greer. And then I had another idea, luckily. I thought, you know what? Bring her down to San Francisco. Bring her down, bring her mother down, bring her maid down, bring Max, get everybody out of San Francisco, and never go there again. Forget all the months of research you did on the 1906 earthquake. There's no point in this. You are just ruining everybody's lives. And so that's what I did. He's awakened by Alice's maid and not this weird hotel guy. There's still people wearing earthquake clothes. I kept a couple sentences, like I was a greedy goblin who would not let his maiden go. But I think the main thing I did is I kind of made it into a comedy. I got him really drunk the night before so that he's really hungover in the morning, and he thinks it's just his hangover that he's experiencing as the earthquake. So I'll read that little bit to you. And then I'm going to turn it over to questions. And I think you'll see, hopefully, that it's better. I awoke to a hail of splinters, the door to my hotel room being burst open at its lock. Mr. Dollar, I can sleep almost anywhere, a train, a car, and perhaps an airplane, although I've never been on one, but I can't awaken anywhere. Oh, wait, I have another pretty picture for you. Oh, isn't that nice? Look at that lady with the umbrella. I open my eyes, unsure of where I am, and I grow briefly afraid. I'm used to waking up in a strange body, but strange rooms terrify me. You will remember, Sammy, how my first week here I bumped my head on your bunk each morning and then cried out like a maiden. You never knew that I thought I was 1,000 miles away, a century before. So that morning at the Del Monte Hotel, I put him in Monterey, California. It took me nearly a minute to register, first of all, that I was in a hotel room and that somehow ended up on the floor, cocooned in quilts. And second, that Bitsy, who's the maid, stood above me in a dazzle of morning light. She's got his name wrong, by the way. She thinks his name is Mr. Dollar. Mr. Dollar! A bellboy was beside her, and I later discovered that it was he and not the powerful Levy maid who had broken the door. I was terrified, as I've said, and a brief tenderness broke the hardness of that woman's face, and I swear she almost reached out to comfort me. But her hand went back to her thick waist, and she shouted, "He's alive!" What's going on? She looked over me appraisingly. You okay? Looks like you got thrown out of bed. Well, I've been known to sleepwalk. Why didn't you answer? Answer what? She gave her head that cockatoo tilt. I've been calling you. What's happened? She grinned a little and nudged the bellboy. He wants to know what's happened. Huh. Bitsy, could you hand me my robe? She ignored my command and instead turned to the bellboy, who held my robe for me. You got that paper? Give him that. I'm downstairs packing, Mr. Dollar. Off to friends in Pasadena if we can, and we won't be back. I put on my robe as she left. A shout came from down the hall, and the bellboy quickly handed me the paper. It was an early edition of the San Jose Evening News, sparsely laid out and full of typos. Stanford University buildings badly wrecked with heavy loss of life. Santa Cruz badly shaken, loss of life heavy, all important buildings destroyed. Thousands of people reported killed in San Francisco. What happened? I whispered. What happened? The answer came, a careless roll of the earth. It felt like a maid making a bed and flicking the sheet until it lies flat, a roll that seemed to come from across the room towards me, sending me down face first. I tasted dust. It was perhaps the fourth aftershock that morning, but the first that I had felt. Earthquake, of course. It will seem brave or heartless to you, but it simply never occurred to me that Mother or Mina might be dead. I think it came from the childish notion that family's too permanent to die, or that God, knowing I had lost a grandmother and a father, would not be so wicked as to take every other lovely thing from my life. This was my hope as I lay there, my heart buzzing and oozing like a shaken hive, and I came to learn that it was a common one. In the following weeks, after the fire had burned its last, you could still see sad handbills. For instance, missing Mrs. Bessie O. Steele, aged 33, dark hair, slender, who was to be at the Rex Hotel. And every one of us understood it was a stupid hope, but a good one. We could not tear them down. I like to think that it was while I lay there listening to the murmurs of people in the hall and the clank of broken china that a small part of that disaster took place. It would have happened at City Hall, which had lost its walls in the quake, and due to an early morning fire was now smoldering room by room. I like to think that the Hall of Records caught fire as I lifted myself off the floor, and that the letter T blazed on as I dressed, dazed, and the birth records of Max Tivoli began to smolder in the box. That's how I felt, at least. The end of Max. Goodbye, old pal. I stood up and my body seemed as light as Dr. Martin's balloon drifting like a teardrop through the rubble and away. Downstairs, people sat in the stuffed chairs and ottomans of the lobby, stunned as hunted animals, waiting for someone to produce coffee despite shattered china and a broken water main. It was almost an amusing sight. People who had been awakened by the 513 tremor had dressed in the dark, and so most of the elegant men and ladies of the Del Monte wore what we later referred to as earthquake clothes. If I had only taken photographs for Blackmail Now. Exclusive heiresses trawling for husbands sat stupefied in evening gowns, riding jackets and men's derbies, their bland, unmade-up faces set off by their best jewels hanging from their necks and ears. Senators and millionaires sat whispering to each other in opera hats, smoking jackets, pantaloons, and slippers. One financier's widow sat in opera black, her face still masked with La Paris night cream. Everyone looked stunned and worried. Perhaps they knew that their fortunes lay in bank vaults, that while fireproof had been so overheated in the blaze that they could not be opened for weeks for fear that the cash would burst into flames. I was staring at people who would soon have no homes and no money. It seems an excellent joke that they had dressed themselves not for the Del Monte, but for a vaudeville version of their lives. There were rumors everywhere. A fat gentleman in a velvet suit was saying that some ghoulish man was going around San Francisco biting off the fingers of dead women to steal their rings, and that mobs had collected at the U.S. Mint about to storm the place ahead of the fire and steal millions in gold bullion. One woman, hiding a yapping dog under her quilted robe, told me that regulars, deputized as soldiers, were walking among the ruins of the city, executing anyone they took for a looter. Children caught stealing were to be beaten. A sign hung around their necks reading, "Thief." "Can you even believe it?" she whispered. And naturally, I could not. I thought once again how stunned and sad and crazy we had become. Executions, indeed. It would turn out, of course, that she was right. "Oh, your friends managed to get a car, I see," she told me, smiling. "What's that?" She motioned towards the window. A simple, ordinary car sat in the driveway, engine idling. "I suppose they're not going to the city," she added. I said nothing as I watched. A wedding cake of luggage slipped into the trunk, a soundless slam, a chauffeur dusting off his hands. The crank went into the auto's silvered yap. I could barely see inside. A picture hat, a feathered fedora. I no longer thought of Huey, the earthquake, of anyone but myself, Mr. Dollar. For in my panic, my stupidity, I had not listened to Bitsy's parting words. Pasadena. I watched the car as it began to vibrate, silently coughing, and then make its slow, unsteady movement down the drive and away. The thought of losing Alice was terrible and petty, but it was too much for my monster's heart. Others around me were chattering and laughing and making plans to find an auto and drive south, loading it with the idiotic junk of their idiotic lives. But I was the king of fools, because I didn't want to save a single coin, not a single life. All I wanted was to keep Alice from escaping again, to keep her imprisoned within the mossy walls of my mossy life. Don't you see? She was not sitting somewhere in the hotel thinking of Asghar who had kissed her. She was headed down to Pasadena. She was headed away from me, as she had once before, and for all I knew, our city had burned to the ground and we would all be scattered across the continent or further, and it would take years for me to find her again. A disaster had brought us together, and a disaster would now tear us apart. I was a greedy goblin who could not let his maiden go. I stood and ran through the lobby. You see, I didn't have years to find her. 3 perhaps, or 5, but not 20 like before, not even 10. It would be too late. My condition would betray me. Because imagine if Alice and her mother fled to Pasadena and then to relatives in Kentucky or Utah, and it took 10 years. Imagine it, to find her. It would all be in vain. This was the thought in my head as I pushed aside a musician hugging a viola. Of course, in 10 years, Alice herself might be faded into her 40s, in bird-like glasses, stout and unnaturally blonde, and married with 2 children toddling by her pinkies, and I would still love her. Of course I would love her. I would still arrive at her door and bow and whisper her name and wait for the blush to cross her breast as it always did. That wasn't the problem. The problem would be that when she opened that door, it wouldn't be a man in his mid-40s, bat-mustached, grinning in her doorway. It would be a boy in his early 20s, smiling in his bronze sun of a face, stretching his sinews within his white tennis shirt. It would be too late. It would be too different. I might seduce her, of course. I might even lure her away from her husband for a weekend in a hotel. But it would be too late for love. Women don't lose their hearts to boys. She would drink down my youth, and one morning, she would pick up her smudged glasses from the bedside table and leave me forever in that rented room, thinking, he'll recover, he's young. But I would never recover. No, if I lost her now, I thought, as I struggled with the crystal knob of the front door, my chances would die a little more each year as I grew younger. Oh, Mother, I remember thinking in my madness, Mother, you were wrong. Time was never on my side. All right, that's it. That's the final version. I realize I read the same thing to you over and over and over, but my point, and this is the moment where you need to think of a question and come forward to these little microphones while I vamp for a little time. My point is that you can see how even in that little passage, how sort of worked over it all is before you end up getting it right. I was ready to throw that thing away, but somehow in that final version, I started focusing again on Alice, and I pulled parts from the first one, and I got my way through it. The nervous breakdown was over, and I finished the damn book. All right, somebody asked me a question. Do I write the book in order? It's a good question. Nabokov used to tell people that he wrote his books like a crossword puzzle, that he would fill in the parts he knew, and then that would help him answer the other parts. And I think that's crap. I don't think he did that. I think it's a very clever thing to say. I have to write from beginning to end because I figure things out along the way that help me understand how the rest goes. But then again, I like a book that is very carefully plotted. So I think a more ethereal book, which is sort of memories, would work if you just wrote different parts of it and saw how they all attach together. But I've got to plot through it. I mean, you saw I plotted the thing out, and then I could only do that by writing it. But you discover things. Originally in my first version of it, he was going to have this sort of nemesis, like a villain, his doctor's son who would know his secret and would sort of threaten with revealing it and would ruin his life, and later at the end would appear with a gun, that was the whole idea. And there was one point, I wrote about 200 pages of it, the book, before I realized that all of it, except 50 pages, was worth nothing. Because I'd written about this sort of nemesis character, and then I realized he already had someone in his life who knew his secret, which is his best friend Huey. And that person had to be the person at the end who he had to make a choice about, and that this villain was a ridiculous decision. And so I cut 150 pages and went all the way back and wrote it again that way. And I think I've written it out of order. I would have gotten to attach to this villain character, Aaron Fess, that was his name. And he was fun to write too, yeah. I love you dearly. Come up to the microphone though, why not? All right. You start at the beginning. I'm going to repeat it because some people probably can't hear you. So really, I start at the beginning and then work things out when I get stuck, and I do. This was it. I think a lot of people might get to the earthquake part and just think, it's trouble, I'm skipping over it. And that probably works for them. But for me, if I hadn't worked through it and refocused myself on writing about Alice, I think I would have gone on with Rats in Chinatown through the rest of the book, you know? I think it was a breakthrough for me in tone and what the book was really about. So for me, I have to do that. And you get attached to stuff, too. I would have liked that character a lot. Aaron Fess. How did I characterize Aaron Fess? I actually tried to put him, tried to publish the part I'd written about him. I mean, we're so greedy with everything we write, we try to get it all published. Because the writer Zadie Smith put together a collection of character sketches called The Book of Other People. So I sent it to her, and oh, God, I can't remember what I wrote about him. I thought it was so clever at the time. But Zadie did not publish that part. She published part of it, another abandoned book. But that one sort of never came together. Yeah. Sometimes you have to let go of things. It's hard. I keep a file called Cuts, where I copy everything I cut out of the book. And I'm always trying to put that stuff back in. Because you're sitting there at the computer and you're thinking, oh, I just need the next sentence, and then I can go on. And you look back in this file and you're like, well, maybe there's something back there. You know, just no one will. I'll just paste it in. They'll never know. And sometimes it works. Sometimes something didn't fit there. But and I did do something. I played a mean trick on my editor. I gave her this book, and she was very wonderful in editing Max Tivoli in its first draft. But she would do this tricky thing. She had a British accent, has one. And she would say, "This paragraph is so wonderful. I am keeping it all to myself. No one else will ever see it. It's mine. And the book will reverberate with its absence." And I thought that was great. I totally went for that. But I played a trick on her, which is one paragraph that I loved and fought for. Well, you don't have to fight. They do anything you like. You don't have to make any changes. I took out of Max Tivoli, and then I put it in my next novel, The Story of a Marriage, just to see if she would catch it. And she never did. It's in the final book. She still can't fish. She's like, which one is it? Just tell me. I don't mind, darling. I don't mind. It's fine, but just tell me which one. I'm like, what? You didn't catch it? You know, it's not yours alone. And she insisted on taking out of Max Tivoli an electric dress that his mother was wearing at a party. And I keep trying to put that back into books, and she catches that every time. She says, there's my favorite thing, the electric dress. Here it is, I found it. And the book I'm working on now, I just put it in a seat, and I cannot wait for her to read it. Because it fits really well. I don't think she can take it out. It's good. It's Halloween in 1918, electric dress, of course. Yeah. Well, I think it's different for every writer. My first editor I had two books. I had a book of short stories and then my first novel called The Path of Minor Planets, where I had one editor who was a young, brilliant guy who does a lot of great work, kind of with more punk rock writers. I don't think you'd call me a punk rock writer, yeah. We struggled a lot with the novel, and then I wouldn't change it. I thought he didn't get it. And then I gave him the manuscript for Max Tivoli, and he turned it down, and then his boss bought that manuscript, and then she fired him. Maybe not for that reason. I think so, though. Because she thought he'd blown it. But the fact was that she got what I was doing. It's not that he's a bad editor. We weren't really in sync. He liked what I wrote, but he couldn't help me with it. And she helps me with everything, but she never tells me what to write. As much as I beg her, I'm like, just tell me the sentence that I should put here. And she says, no, because I don't want you to ever think that anyone else's name should be on this book. It's your book. Every sentence is one that you invented yourself. She says it in that lovely accent. And she's awfully patient. It's amazing to have someone who you can call at 2 in the morning and answer the phone and who will listen to you weeping and know all the names of your characters and all the scenes you're talking about and put up with it because they have to. But it works really well for me. Because what I do is I write a whole first draft and don't show it to anyone. And then I show it only to her. Because she's gentle and pushy. And that's helpful. Yeah, it's helpful for me.
Who do you read?
Who do I read? Well, it's a funny question to ask a writer because we give a weird answer. I read things that help me with the book I'm working on. So Brian DeSalvatore just asked me this question at dinner, and I just finished reading Jonathan Letham's new novel, Chronic City, because I think it's a book kind of like what I'm working on, because it's slightly fantastic, and it's wonderful storytelling, and it's inventive, and it's fun, and it seems like he's having a fun time, and I'd like to imitate that. And then I just finished that yesterday, and so I'm starting for the second time 2 books by Colette, Cherie and The Last of Cherie, which you may not have heard of, but which will be a major motion picture soon with Michelle Pfeiffer, and then you'll know what I'm talking about. And you know, Colette is sort of an old-fashioned French writer. Maybe it's a little silly, but it's incredibly fun. And I'm looking to it for, because I have a first-person female narrator, and I want to see what she does with that person. Now, these are not, one of them is a contemporary novel, and one is a novel, really nobody's reading anymore. But for me, I'm not really trying to stay on top of things. I'm trying to pick the next sentence. I'm panicked over it. And so if I can steal from Colette and have no one notice, I'm fine with that. Anything to get, I will sell my soul for the next sentence every day. Every day I sit there in the office and I think, I cannot do it. 3 pages, it's never going to happen. You sit there until the blood spatters on the screen, and then you've done it by the end of the day. And you think, whew, that was great. I don't have to do that again. And the next day you do, yeah. Someone looks like they're at the microphone.
Hi, I'm Mike. I'm a writer with the Kaiman here at the university. So I guess I just want to ask, did you get the idea from Benjamin Button?
Finally, someone's asked it. Yeah. I had never heard of that story, and I would venture to say most people hadn't. My agent and my editor had never heard of it because it's not his most famous story. It's in a collection, Tales of the Jazz Age, which you read the whole thing, of course it's in there, but I think he's most famous for like A Diamond is Big as the Ritz and stuff like that. So I didn't know anything about it. I wrote the whole book, and then once I'd finished writing it, and I'd sold it to my publisher, I went online and I Googled Aging Backwards and staggered back from the computer in horror at the words F. Scott Fitzgerald and Brad Pitt. I thought, it's over before it's begun. I had no idea. Not only that, but there was a short story collection called The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, Apartment 3G, which came out the year before my book, and was a retelling of that story, and was really great. And even more than that, The Time Traveler's Wife came out that seemed to be awfully similar in all these different ways. And I started fainting every couple minutes. Everyone would tell me about, oh, have you read The Sword and the Stone? Merlin ages backwards. And you might be aware that in Alice with the Looking Glass, the White Queen ages backwards. And did you ever see Mork and Mindy in the 70s? Jonathan Winters ages backwards in that. I mean, it's incredible vanity that we have to think that we have any original ideas. The great thing that happened was John Updike, in his review of this book in The New Yorker, talked about all of those and just cleared the air. He basically said, here's all the versions of the same story, which goes back to Plato, I would say. I mean, Fitzgerald is the one we've heard of because there's a movie about it, but there are thousands of stories of people aging backwards. It's just heartbreak every time I give a reading and someone says, "Have you seen the Star Trek episode of the..." No, I'm in great company, you know. Mark Twain and Samuel Taylor. It's great. But John Updike basically cleared it all out, and he said, this is the first person to ever write a novel about this, and clearly he's aware of all the precedents, and everything's fine. And that movie was a movie that was famous in Hollywood that it was never going to get made. They couldn't figure out a script. They couldn't figure out how to tell the story for a movie. And so there was no fear. And I would hear these things, like I would hear my agent would get like a interest from Eminem, maybe make a movie with Gwen Stefani and Eminem, a modern day man aging backwards. I get a call the next day. That was a real conversation I had. If you can call it real when your conversation is with Hollywood. And then the next day they said, oh, they're not interested. They heard about this maybe Brad Pitt movie. And then I never heard from Paramount until they actually offered me money for the rights to Max Tivoli, to own it forever and bury it. And it was a lot of money. And I said, no. And they came back and they offered more money. And I said, no. And they came back and offered more money. And I said, I don't think you heard me, Paramount Pictures. And I thought, there, that settled that. And, oh, I made the wrong decision. Absolutely, yeah. Take the money and run. What are you thinking? But their hands are clean, and my hands are clean. Because although they obviously read Max Tivoli, because they were making an offer on it, the screenwriter didn't read it. And if you look at that movie, there's nothing about it that has any of the same characters or plot points. There's similarities in tone and in some of the way the story is told, and I really just think that that's the only way you can tell this story in a long form. And he and I found the same solution. And that's the lovely thing I try to say about it and be gracious. But the sad thing is that here's a book that I used to say to people on airplanes, what do you do? I'm a writer. What kind of writer? Novelist. What do you write? Fiction. I wrote a book about a man aging backwards. And they go, oh, I've heard of that book. I saw you on the Today Show. And now they say, are you aware of a movie about that with Brad Pitt? I'm like, of course I'm aware of a movie about that. And so now people ask me what I write, and I say, oh, you won't have heard of me. This is not your favorite thing to say about yourself, you know. But I've written other books, and it'll be fine. Yeah. Anyway, thank you guys, all of you, for coming tonight. I'm so glad to be back, and thank you for reading the book. I'm going to be signing outside.